Do you have basic sewing skills and want to put them to good use? Do you like using your hands, doing something that might take a long time, but it's a very rewarding process? You get to make quilts. Quilts are, they're this right here. They are fun, hands-on, and it is a great hobby to have. They are rewarding. You put all your hard work into making this quilt and you get a beautiful, warm piece when you are done. I am talking to you about quilts today because I have been making quilts for roughly 8 years now. I have entered some of my quilts in my county fair's 4-H program and I won the fair 3 times. In this speech today, I will be telling you how to pick a design for your quilt, how to get materials for your quilt, how to cut the pieces, piece the pieces together or sew them together, and then finish the quilt with your binding. First, I would like to start with designing your quilt. Many people decide to choose a pre-made design. You can find these in quilting magazines, quilting books, or online, which is a very popular one now. This is very simple. All the measurements and the materials you need is all laid out in the design packet. A more difficult option is you can design your own. This involves lots of math. You have to calculate the size of each piece and how it's going to fit in your large quilt as itself. Each square will need to be calculated and added. Each piece will need 1/2 inch more on each side for your seam allowance. Once you have your design picked, you will need to find your material. You need to get good quality material. When you are quilting, it can be rough on the materials, so you do not want to be halfway through your quilt and have it ripped in half. Quilter's weight cotton is, personally, I think the best to get. It is 100% cotton. Sherry McConnell, author of The Best Fabrics for Quilting, published in 2013, she says, "It is quality 100% cotton fabric, perfectly suited for quilting." Your thread should also be 100% cotton. If your thread breaks on you, then your whole quilt is gonna fall apart and it just will not look good. Another thing you will need is the batting. Most people do not know what batting is. If you look at a quilt, it is not just 2 pieces of material, there is some thickness to it. The batting is the piece that goes in between. This does not really matter, it is up to your preference. The batting can be as thick as you like it or as thin as you like it. Once you have all your pieces done, you will need to cut out your pieces. Most quilts have pieces that are made of all straight edges. This is done by using a rotary cutter blade and a measuring board. You lay the material flat and you lay the board on top, and then you slide the blade along the edge. If you have pieces that are not straight edge cuts, you will need to do scissors. Most likely though, that is for pieces like that will be in more complicated quilts. Once you have all of your pieces cut out, then it is time to sew it together or piece it together. A machine like this is used when piecing the quilt together. The process of piecing the quilt is quite simple. You just need to follow along with your pre-made pattern and keep your seam allowance. A seam allowance is the bit of material that is on the other side of the seam. So each one of these pieces has a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the other side. Nikki Johnson wrote in her blog, Seam Allowances on fabric.com, for quilting, many, including myself, recommend a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This allows for your pieces to stay together strongly and they will not fall apart. If it is larger than a 1/4 inch, it might get puffy and it just will not lay flat. So your pieces that you have cut out look like this. For example, this is one of the flowers on the quilt behind me. It starts out with a purple square, a blue square, they're sewn together. A second blue square is sewn onto that piece, and then a smaller yellow square is sewn on top of the purple square. and then 4 of those are put together to form a flower. After each seam is sewn, you need to press it flat so that way it lays completely flat. Once you have all of your pieces put together and sewn together, it is time for quilting. People sometimes get this confused because the whole process is making a quilt, but it is called quilting because of this next step. Quilting is the process of taking the front of the quilt, the batting in the middle, and the back of the quilt and combining it together. Normally people like to sew their quilts together on a large quilting machine. I personally use a manual machine. It looks like this. You hook up your quilt and then you move the machine with both hands and you make a design on the quilt. There are also automatic versions of this machine that you just put in your design and start the machine and it'll make it for you. Another option is tying your quilt together. Pieces of yarn are taken throughout the quilt and tied together. I believe it is a simpler option. It does not look as great in my opinion. Once you have the quilt all put together and you're done quilting, you will have to cut off the excess to make your quilt the proper desired length. Once you are done with that, it is time to move on to binding. Binding is the finishing piece that closes off the quilt. It is this piece on the end. It gives it a finished look. It is sewn on by machine on this side, and then on the back side, it is sewn by hand around the perimeter of the quilt. A blind stitch is used so that way it looks more clean. Now you know how to make a quilt. I have shown you how to find a design, pick your material, cut that material, then sew it together, and then quilt that material and bind off to form your lovely quilt. Now, this may not be for everyone. It is a time-consuming process, but I find it to be a great hobby. If you have extra time and you want something to do with your hands, this process is rewarding and you get this beautiful piece that you can hang in your house, or you can do a larger one like shown here and it can be laid across a bed. I hope you have lots of fun making all of your quilts and on your quilting adventures. You now have a skill that not everyone has. You can quilt. Maybe teach someone else.